Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive with us today?
Always excited to dive in.
Well, get ready because we're going to be looking at something you can actually see.
Oh,
Uh,
intriguing. Something visual.
Yeah, we're talking about color in film.
Hmm.
More specifically, how color can be used to tell a story.
Ah, I see. So not just pretty pictures, but how color can have a deeper meaning.
Right. And to help us explore this, we're going to be focusing on a movie that really plays with this idea, Pleasantville.
Pleasantville. Yeah, I remember that one. It's about a brother and sister who get trapped in this old black and white TV show, right?
Exactly. And it's not just a fun trip back to the 50s. It actually uses that black and white setting to say something pretty profound about how we view the past and how we deal with change.
I'm starting to see where this is going. So we've got the movie itself as our main source, I assume.
Plus we've got some really interesting articles about the film. One's an academic piece that digs deep into the symbolism and how Pleasantville connects to bigger cultural anxieties about the past.
Symbolism always adds those layers.
Oh, absolutely. And we've also got a piece on the history of colorization in film, which is going to be really relevant.
Colorization. Now that takes me back to those old Ted Turner colorized movies.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
Didn't
Didn't they cause quite a stir back in the day?
a stir. It was a full-blown controversy. A lot of people felt like it was a sacrilege to mess with those classic films.
Like adding mustaches to the Mona Lisa?
Exactly. It felt like tampering with history itself. Like we were trying to erase the fact that those films were made in a different time with different technology and a different aesthetic.
So it was more than just about the visuals. It was about preserving the authenticity of those films, right?
Absolutely. Film scholar Paul Grange actually called it textual amnesia. Like we were trying to wipe away the visual pastness that made those films unique.
Textual amnesia. I like that. It really captures that sense of trying to make the past fit into our modern sensibilities.
Right, and there was this fear that by colorizing these films, we were sanitizing history, making it more palatable to modern audiences, but losing something essential in the process.
So it became this big debate about preserving the past versus using modern technology to maybe enhance it, or in some cases, maybe distort it.
And that's where Pleasantville comes in.
Yeah.
It jumps right into the middle of that debate. But instead of shying away from colorization, it uses it as a deliberate storytelling tool.
Ah, so it's not just colorizing for the sake of it. It's using it in a way that's actually meaningful to the story.
Exactly. It becomes a commentary on that very debate we were just talking about. And the way it does it is so clever. The film starts in this idealized black and white world. It's a parody of those squeaky clean 1950s sitcoms with their perfect families and simple morality.
Right, where everything's neat and tidy and no one ever gets their hands dirty.
Precisely. But as the characters start experiencing things outside that limited world, things like sexuality, art, even rock and roll color starts to seep in.
That's such a brilliant visual metaphor. It's like experiencing these things that were previously taboo literally brings color into their world.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. The deeper we go, the more we see that color represents so much more than just visual change.
It's like it's hinting at something below the surface, right?
Absolutely. Color becomes this metaphor for all sorts of change. It's about challenging social norms, the awakening of individuality, the questioning of authority. The more the characters push against the constraints of their Pleasantville existence, the more colorful, literally vibrant their world becomes.
Which is interesting when you contrast it with other movies from the 90s that were all about nostalgia, like Forrest Gump, for instance.
That's a great comparison. Grange actually mentions that in his article, Forrest Gump uses nostalgia to romanticize the past, while Pleasantville uses it to satirize that very idea.
So it's kind of saying, hey, those good old days weren't so good for everyone.
Yeah.
And change, even if it's messy, can be a really good thing.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that it's not just about color versus black and white. It goes even deeper than that. Film scholar Florian Marshall actually identified 6 distinct color modes the film uses, each with its own purpose in the story.
Wait, 6? That's incredible. Tell me more.
Well, we've already talked about the first 2. That stark black and white representing that initial, almost sterile state of Pleasantville, and then those selective bursts of color, often highlighting symbolic objects or moments of change for a character.
Right, like that red rose or that fire that erupts when Betty experiences something new. It's like color is a visual representation of those aha moments, those breakthroughs.
Exactly. It's that spark of awareness, that realization that there's more to life than what they've been told. Now, the third mode is where it gets really intriguing, what Marshall calls the historical mode. This is where the film uses color to mimic the look of those old, faded Technicolor films, particularly from the 1950s.
Oh, like those home movies everyone's parents used to have. A little washed out, maybe a bit too much red.
Exactly. And it's used very deliberately often in flashbacks or dream sequences, particularly those involving Bud the teenager who's transported from the 90s. It's almost like a visual reminder of how we tend to view the past through this romanticized lens. Even those old home movies, which might seem mundane now, were once someone's vibrant, colorful present.
It's like the film is saying, don't be fooled by the surface. Even those seemingly perfect, colorful moments from the past have their own complexities and maybe even some hidden darkness.
That's a brilliant insight. Then you have mode 4, which is that full-blown, vibrant color that we see as Pleasantville starts to really embrace change. Those initial splashes of color become a flood, transforming the whole visual landscape. Think of that scene where Bud and Mr. Johnson paint that colorful mural on the side of the soda shop. It's a literal and symbolic explosion of color representing the town's growing acceptance of individuality and self-expression.
It's like Pleasantville is finally coming alive. And that mural itself is such a powerful image, this direct challenge to the town's attempts to suppress art and freedom of expression.
Absolutely. Now, in contrast to those vibrant colors, we have mode 5, those stylized black and white sequences. These are often short, almost dreamlike interludes, and they draw heavily on film noir aesthetics.
Film noir. Those dark, shadowy films from the 1940s and 50s, right? With the dramatic lighting and mysterious characters.
Precisely. And to incorporate that style into a film set in the 1950s is a brilliant move. Remember, those classic noirs were often seen as a reflection of the anxieties and uncertainties lurking beneath the surface of post-war America. They explored themes of crime, corruption, disillusionment, things that were very much at odds with that idealized view of the 1950s that Pleasantville initially presents.
So it's like using a visual style associated with a darker, more cynical period to hint at the darkness that might be lurking beneath Pleasantville's supposed perfection.
Exactly. It's another way the film subtly undermines those simplistic assumptions about the past. And then you have the final mode, which is a bit more subtle. It's what Marshall calls the desaturated mode, where the colors are muted, almost washed out.
So kind of the opposite of that vibrant full color mode. Why would they use that?
It's often used in scenes that depict the more mundane or everyday aspects of life in Pleasantville, even after color has been introduced. For example, think about those scenes in the Parker household. Even as the family starts to experience those colorful changes, their home, their furniture, their clothes, they often remain in this desaturated color palette.
It's almost like those aspects of their lives are still stuck in that old, limited way of thinking, even as other parts of their world are becoming more vibrant and open to change. It's like the change hasn't fully reached those corners yet.
That's a really insightful observation, and it highlights how change isn't always this complete overnight transformation. It can be a gradual process with some parts of our lives clinging to those old patterns, even as we're trying to embrace something new.
Wow, these 6 color modes are blowing my mind. It's incredible how much thought went into using color to tell this story. It's so much more than just a visual gimmick. It's woven into the very fabric of the film.
You got it. And what's remarkable is that these modes aren't always clearly separated. They blend and transition into each other, reflecting the fluid nature of change itself. Just like life, it's not always this clear-cut progression from black and white to full color. It's more complex, more nuanced, and the film captures that beautifully.
And that complexity is what makes the film so compelling. It's not just about the visuals. It's about how those visuals work with the narrative to challenge our assumptions about the past, about social norms about ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a film that invites us to question, to explore, to look beyond the surface, and discover those hidden layers of meaning. And it does it in a way that's both visually stunning and intellectually engaging.
Now I'm even more curious about those specific scenes and how these different color modes are used to create those aha moments.
Yeah.
There was a scene mentioned earlier in Roger Ebert's review about the soda shop owner, Mr. Johnson, experiencing art for the first time.
Yep.
I feel like that's where a lot of this comes together.
That's a pivotal scene, and it perfectly illustrates how the film uses color to symbolize a character's emotional and intellectual awakening. Shall we dive into that scene next?
Absolutely. Let's see those colors come to life.
Okay, so 6 color modes. It's like Pleasantville is speaking a whole other language with color.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we've already covered those first 2 modes, that stark black and white world, and then those pops of color when something changes.
Right, those bursts of color. It's like the film is saying, wake up, look, there's something new here.
Exactly. And then we get to that 3rd mode, the historical mode, which is where things get really interesting.
Ah, yes, the historical mode. It's like stepping back in time visually.
It is. It's like the film is using color to imitate those old Technicolor films from the 50s.
Yeah.
A little bit faded, a little bit too much red. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It's like those old home movies we all have tucked away somewhere.
Exactly. And it's used in such a clever way in Pleasantville. often in those flashback scenes or dream sequences.
Especially with Bud, the teenager who gets transported from the 90s, it's like those faded colors represent his memories or his perception of the past.
It's almost like saying, hey, remember, things weren't always as bright and shiny as they seem in our memories.
You got it. And it plays into that whole idea of how we tend to romanticize the past.
It's like those old home movies. Even if they seem dull now, there was someone's lived experience, their present moment full of color and life.
And that brings us to mode 4, which is the complete opposite of that faded historical look. This is where we get that full-blown, vibrant color as Pleasantville starts to embrace change.
Yeah, I think the town is waking up and exploding with color.
Think of that scene with the mural. You know when Bud and Mr. Johnson paint the side of the soda shop?
Oh, yeah. That's a great example. It's a literal explosion of color. It's like they're taking all those suppressed emotions and ideas and splashing them onto the wall.
And the town's reaction to that mural is so telling. It shows how art and self-expression can be seen as threatening by those who want to maintain the status quo.
It's like the mural becomes this symbol of change. And change can be scary for people, especially in a place like Pleasantville, where everything's supposed to be perfect and unchanging.
Exactly. Now, in contrast to all that vibrancy, we have mode 5, which is kind of a surprise. It's where the film goes back to black and white, but not the clean, simple black and white from the beginning.
Oh, yeah, I remember these scenes. They're more stylized, darker, more shadowy.
Exactly. They're almost like little film noir moments dropped into this 50s setting.
Film noir, that's an interesting choice for a film that's supposed to be about this idyllic time period.
Well, remember those classic film noirs were often about what was lurking beneath the surface of society. The darkness, the corruption, the disillusionment, things that didn't quite fit with that picture-perfect image of post-war America.
So it's like those black and white film noir scenes are hinting at something darker, more complex going on in Pleasantville.
Precisely. It's like a visual reminder that things aren't always what they seem. And even in that seemingly perfect 50s world, there were shadows and secrets.
Makes you think twice about those good old days, huh?
It does. And then finally we have mode 6, the desaturated mode.
Desaturated, so like washed out color.
Exactly. It's this muted color palette that's used for certain scenes, even after color has been introduced to Pleasantville.
So it's not just black and white versus color. It's like there's this whole spectrum of color being used to tell the story.
That's a great way to put it. And think about those scenes in the Parker household. Even as the family starts to experience those colorful changes, their home, their clothes, it all remains in this desaturated palette.
It's almost like those aspects of their lives are still stuck in that old way of thinking, even as other parts of their world are becoming more vibrant.
Exactly. It highlights how change isn't always this sudden transformation. It can be a gradual process with some parts of us holding on to the old ways, even as we're trying to embrace something new.
It's like the film is saying change takes time, and it's not always easy.
And that's what makes these 6 color modes so fascinating. They're not just a gimmick. They're a way to show the complexity of change. The way it can be both exciting and unsettling, gradual and sudden, personal and societal.
And those different modes are often blended together, right?
Absolutely. It's not like the film is rigidly sticking to one mode at a time.
Yeah.
They flow into each other, mirroring how change itself is often fluid and unpredictable.
It's like the film is a visual representation of how messy and complicated life can be, and how even in the midst of change, there's beauty to be found.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of beauty, I think it's time we revisit that scene with Mr. Johnson in the art book. That scene where he really starts to see the world in a new light.
Yes. Let's dive into that because I think it perfectly illustrates how Pleasantville uses color to show a character's transformation. Okay, so Mr. Johnson, the soda jerk, he's stuck in this black and white routine just like everyone else in Pleasantville. But then he sees this art book and everything changes.
It's like a light bulb goes off in his head. It's this pivotal moment where he starts to see the world differently. And the way the film uses color to show that transformation is just brilliant.
It really is. You can almost see the color coming to life within him as he's looking at those paintings.
Exactly. And it's not just any art book, remember? It's filled with works by artists like Turner and Van Gogh, artists known for their vibrant use of color.
Right. It's like those paintings are this portal to a world beyond black and white, a world that Mr. Johnson never even knew existed.
And as he's absorbing those images, we see these flashes of color start to appear on him. It's subtle at first, but it's like the color is literally spreading from the inside out.
It's a visual representation of his consciousness expanding, of him waking up to the possibilities beyond Pleasantville.
Precisely. And then he decides to paint Betty. And that's where things really get interesting.
because he paints her in color, in the nude, which causes a huge uproar in Pleasantville.
It's a scandal. It's a rebellion. It's a complete rejection of everything that Pleasantville stands for.
And the film emphasizes that by having that painting be the trigger for a riot, the townspeople who are still clinging to that black and white worldview, they're outraged by this burst of color, by this challenge to their carefully constructed norms.
It's like they're trying to suppress the change that's already happening, to force everything back into black and white. But it's too late. The color has already taken root, and it's only going to spread from there.
And then you have Big Bob, the mayor, who represents that resistance to change. He's so threatened by anything that challenges his vision of a perfect monochrome world.
He tries to control everything. He tries to impose all these rules to keep the color out, but it's like trying to hold back the tide. It's just not possible.
And that's one of the most powerful messages of Pleasantville. Change is inevitable. You can't fight it. You can't suppress it. The best you can do is embrace it.
And find the beauty in it, even if it's messy, even if it's challenging, even if it makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Exactly. Pleasantville is a film that really makes you think about the power of change and how we all have our own Pleasantvilles in a way. Those areas where we might be clinging to black and white thinking, where we're afraid to embrace the color, the vibrancy, the messiness of life.
So the question is, what are the Pleasantvilles in your own life? What are those areas where you might be holding yourself back from experiencing the full spectrum of what life has to offer?
That's such a thought-provoking question. It makes me want to go back and watch Pleasantville again with fresh eyes, to see all those layers of meaning we've been talking about.
It's a film that rewards multiple viewings. And it's a great reminder that even in a world that seems saturated with color, there's always more to see, more to explore, more to understand.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Pleasantville. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the film and what it means to you.
Head over to our website or social media and share your insights. Let's keep this conversation about color and change going.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time.